I'm going to ask one question, which is a really big picture question, which is we've heard really powerfully an argument that the church does have a huge amount to offer in this moment of kind of multiple crises, of meta-crises. And those of you who were here may well have come and you saw that the word church was in the title of the event. But I'm hoping that there's some people here who might not call themselves Christians, who might be from other faiths or might not know what they're called or might be non-religious. And certainly if there aren't any here, there's certainly a huge number in our society and a growing number who might hear all this talk of Christianity and the church having something to offer and really raise an eyebrow. They might feel actively hostile, they might feel nervous about a power grab, though that idea might just bounce straight off them. So I think there's a massive legitimacy gap between what we have to offer and our ability to offer it. And I wanted to hear any of your thoughts on that. I'll go to John first.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and we have to face that, and especially in the face of child abuse scandals and evidence of absolutely staggering hypocrisy. This is seriously problematic, especially if you think, as I do, that, you know, Catholic and Anglican and other parts of other Christian denominations have very important social teaching that in some ways contains at least some of the answers, but how can they get an audience? And I would say that in a way it is by sort of turning away from sort of these narrowly institutional foci that in a way you could put this the other way around. They could only recover as religious bodies now if they do get much more involved in the social and political sphere, if they try to show both in theory and in practice how they do actually have a transforming vision to offer. And in many ways, I think we're moving into an era where the laity are going to be more important than the clergy, and I can see evidence of that everywhere. And I think also it's very important to, I don't think there's a sort of big gap between you know, sort of religious teaching and philosophy. But nonetheless, I think we live in an era where people have profound problems, even sort of grasping ideas about the soul or the spirit, or understanding why there might be anything other than an evolutionary explanation of the reality that we live in, that they have problems in seeing the need for a metaphysical dimension and not just a physical dimension. And I think that the churches need to sort of tackle that middle area if they're going to, you know, find a voice at all. That there's and in some ways this is a very acute problem in the West. You know, it's much easier talking to people in Asia where they haven't lost these traditional frameworks, or maybe in Africa, but certainly in the case of Europe and North America, I think philosophy and politics are very important for the church in this respect, and we gain an audience simply by speaking and acting in the right kind of way.
Thank you. Anyone like to add anything?
Yeah, I think I was just going to say about the laity, who is the church? What is the church? The church is not just the institutions and the hierarchy, important as they are. The church is us, is people who are in every walk of life, in every sector, and I think we have a great sort of unmined seam there of potentiality. And yes, there's a lot of social action that goes on already, but I think the majority of the people of the church are people of goodwill, but who potentially have not thought, oh, I could get stuck into that, because potentially they think it's just the usual suspects, it's the activists that do those things. And, you know, I think there's a lot of desire to make a constructive contribution. So one of the things that we've done is, and this kind of ties into what John was saying earlier about virtuous leadership and how do we form the people of the church in that way, and also people generally in society. I think there's a kind of hunger now for, I suppose it's a story of responsibility, of people wanting to feel that they can make a contribution that matters. And so we talk about vocational responsibility, and we've put together a sort of curriculum, a workshop and a schools program and other things like that, which help people to find a role, a sense of meaning and purpose. And we draw on the Christian traditions, but not always in religious language, because I think sometimes being coupled with the problematic image of the church, of the institutional churches, that actually can sometimes be a barrier to entry. And I think a lot of the principles of human dignity, responsibility, subsidiarity, solidarity, participation, reconciliation, these are things that most people could sign up to.
You've broken the jargon record there.
Sorry, but I think the point is, I think most people get that.
Of course.
Most people get these kind of principles. I mean, I've friends of mine who are atheists combined that completely, and they don't necessarily have to share the belief. But I think there is this this sort of hole that people feel in their lives of purpose, and it's as if like everybody is called to something unique. And if you're just selling people a story of rights, and that's just, it's not fulfilling. People don't find their place through that kind of narrative.
Thank you. To add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you sort of go back to the apostolic age and the church that emerges after the resurrection, it is an on-the-ground movement of change. And I think that we've got to get back to that. And I think that it's about us living deeply in place and staying, hanging around and hanging out with people and journeying with people. And I think the reality is we're living in a society where policies will come and go, governments will come and go, funding will come and go. But the church should be there in season and out of season, beavering away in the background. At times, the left hand not saying what the right hand is doing, but just being there on the ground for people. And if we got back to that, it would shout louder than the noisy voices that we hear right now.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's very easy for me to love the church because I'm not a Christian, so that just, and I do want to say that there is a distinctive language within it that is absolutely necessary, and that revolves around, so John would be too modest to say, but it's full of jargon, but it's really brilliant, is Theology and Social Theory that John wrote is a really vital book, because it indicates that if you just use people, the technical jargon would be utilitarian instrumentalism, okay, but it's just a way of talking about using people.
I feel like this has backfired on me.
Yeah, I'm just trying to, I'm working against my nature and I'm trying to be good. So
thank you.
Is that you cannot understand this world without two concepts. One is sin and one is redemption. That unless you comprehend that we are all capable of hurting others, using others, and that thing, and that the antidote to that is grace, these are vital concepts for the resurrection of a democratic nation, and these are carried. And the other thing is exactly what Mike says, is that what I witness as someone who travels around is that the church is present in every place. That it is a witness to the degradation of the human form, and it is a promise of the elevation of it. So, and just to finally add that I went on this pilgrimage with the Shia in Iraq from Najaf to Karbala, and it was also infused with this sense of grace, of pluralism, of community. So the paradox, if you like, apologies for using that word, is that there can be no redemption of citizenship without faith, right? That's the fundamental thing, because it just reduces itself to a materialist secularism that degrades the person to a thing and nature to a commodity. So there's a vital thing there.
We had a question from Tycho on tribalism versus individualism, from Clive on whose table are we talking about with the church, and if it's not institutions that are going to bring transformation, what's the alternative? And from Mark on, do we need a church if the state is successful?
Okay. So I'm very sympathetic to what you say. We're social beings and a sense of belonging and solidarity and inherited, so tribalism. So I'll never renounce my religion. I'd never renounce my football team, and I seem incapable of renouncing my party either. So I don't. There's lots of reasons for doing all three, but I don't. So I get that, but then there's an issue of a common good in a polity, which is how do those tribes relate one to the other, and what is the basis of that? I had a bit of trouble, Clive, hearing, but so there's institutions are embodiments of meaning too. So there's degraded institutions, and the idea I think that John's getting at with virtuous leadership, that's another paradox, is there is no democracy without leadership. It's a vital aspect, and all aspects of democracy come back to that. So the idea is that institutions have to be held accountable in order to be virtuous, but the idea is not to abolish the institutions, renew them, and in fact we need more within our body politic. And then to get to this point is that within the inheritance in England in particular, as I understand it, is that the church is a fundamental representative of society. It's not an addition to the state. It's not there to provide services, but to provide redemption through community. What the concept of communion is about, and when it gets subordinated to those external logics of money or power, it's graceless. But so the church is a form of resistance, the sanctuary idea, to the domination of the earthly powers, and that's the fundamental. So I agree with you at one level that because the dominant rationality is instrumental, what do we do and what's the point and what's the use of it? It does get involved in aspects of life where it has to be procedural, loveless, and those things, but fundamentally it actually represents the concept of the social in defiance of those two other dominant forms.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think there is a multifaceted conversation in terms of the point about kind of the therapeutic mop. Well, actually, I think it's not just clearing up the mess of the state, but I think that the church has a role in challenging the structural sin that impacts people's lives on a daily basis, as well as dealing with the personal sin that we all grapple with as people of faith. And then, of course, there's that communal aspect, and lots has been said about that. I'm a student of black theology, and when we think of the black church, we think of three ethics in the black church. Firstly, what we would describe as the survival ethic, but actually church is about making it through, coming together on a Sunday, communal, and whatever life has thrown at you from Monday to Saturday, you come and you dance and you enjoy yourself. And the second aspect is what you might describe as the elevational aspect, where you're uplifting people, where life is becoming better. And we know that many people's lives who have been transformed because of their interaction both with faith and the church. But the critical element for society and for really making impactful change is what we might describe as the liberational element. But actually we want to see liberation, we want to see transformation of structures so that they work for people and not against people.
Thank you.
Well, in relation to the tribalism question, I think actual real historical tribes were not just about their own identity. They thought they were representing the cosmic order. So when they met other tribes, there was a certain immediate sympathy. They understood, or there could be, they understood that to some degree they were doing the same kind of thing. And it seems to me that it's important that real thick local identities are also, somehow connected to the universal. They're trying to participate in that. But you can only do that in a local and particular way. But as Maurice is saying, you can sympathize with other people trying to do the same thing. I think that the bad tribes are precisely kind of the modern secular tribes who listened, too strongly to something like social Darwinism. So it's about the survival of the fittest. It's about, some kind of breeding or some kind of sense that their tribe is superior, or a kind of defense of simply your identity because it's threatened. And this is why, in a different way, I'm agreeing with Maurice that if you lose that religious dimension to identity and community, it becomes poisonous. And then you are just stuck with sort of liberalism and freedom, and we know that becomes just terribly selfish, and it produces a super rich and so on. And this is why I'm saying that, in a totally non-Blair kind of way, the church needs to explore a third alternative, community that's not kind of exclusive. The second question, I think we've got to try to undercut this duality of community and institution. Perhaps the key word here is citizenship. Members of churches are citizens of the city of God. They compose that through participation. There's nothing in the church over against them, and the church has got to get rid of this whole modern model of politics ever since the 17th century, whereby you've got the idea of something called the state that's sovereign and over against us, instead of the ancient idea that we, the citizens, who compose the political body. And I think what we need to encourage is that everybody should be a citizen and nobody should be a bourgeois. What I mean by that is nobody should be just pursuing their self-interest or doing work to feed their family. That's never enough. You should, in every role, every work role, every economic role, you should also literally be a politician, because you should be contributing to the social good and the well-being of everybody. We need to abolish the professional politicians. We all need to be a politician. And my final remark then about the church mopping up, I think if we have this idea of the primacy of society, the point is not that the church is doing charitable work that the state should be doing, but much more that all that sort of work needs to be mutual, reciprocal, and everybody should be involved with it. So it's not a sort of second best alternative, it's fundamental. And Tawney, in his great Labour treatise, The Acquisitive Society, sounds now unbelievable. The last chapter is about ecclesiology. It's called something like the Guild of Guilds. And so the idea is that the church is somehow the place where all the different mutual associations are coming together to celebrate in terms of worship their common humanity. It's that kind of vision that I think we need to recover.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm just going to respond to the tribalism question. I think what I was trying to say, or what I was thinking was that I was thinking about identity politics, tribalism, really. And I'm not a theologian.
Yes.
I'm not a theologian or a politician, but the way I've kind of worked it out in my own head is that kind of me culture, social individualism, has sort of morphed through a prism of a rights-based sort of grievance culture into an identity politics, where ironically it's actually undermining the uniqueness of the individual human person. Because the human person is a social being, somehow to reduce the person to somebody who's just a member of a group by virtue of their grievances is to really reduce us as a human being. Is that right?
Yeah.
I mean, as a white, straight woman, that's not how I feel about myself. I'm a friend, I'm a mother, I'm a daughter, I'm a granddaughter. I exist in relationship with other people. I refuse to be described by those group identity tags and labels. It doesn't describe me as a human person. So I think, Martin Luther King would be turning in his grave. He said people should be judged on the content of their character and not by the colour of their skin. That's entirely what identity politics are now doing. So there's this great irony that, it's come from the culture of individualism, but it's actually undermining the uniqueness of the human person.
Yeah.
Thank you. We're going to take some more questions. So we're going to start this end. We've got Molly about how do you bring the metaphysical dimension into discussions around climate change, Robert about this kind of hegemony of secular assumptions and how could you break those barriers so that particularly younger people could engage with this resource of wisdom, and Daniel with really, I think, are we heading for another civil war, and how might we avoid it?
Okay, I'll be quite quick. Molly, it occurred to me straight away that there is actually something you could read, which is called Laudato Si, which is an encyclical by Pope Francis. It's really easy to read. It's not like some of the other encyclicals prior to him, which was hard to read. And it's entirely relating to the subject you were talking about. And it's a very inspiring piece. And it links, it really means our care for our common home. And it's about ecology and care for the planet, but also about integral relationship of people with the planet. So I think if you start with that, you'll get onto a great footing. And there's quite a lot of resources. If you come and see me afterwards, I can point you in the right direction. And Robert, just a quick response to that. We've developed a 10-week program for schools entirely trying to address the issue you're talking about young people. How can we help them access that wisdom and knowledge in language that is on their wavelength? So again, I'm happy to share that with anybody that's interested. It's written deliberately in non-religious language, but it draws on the principles of Christian social thought, and it's introducing them to the idea of the dignity of the human person, valuing each other, responsibility, and so on. So again, that's the resource. It's currently being piloted in 2 schools in London, and I would be very interested if there are anyone here who's got links with schools who'd like to have a look at it. And Daniel's point, I rather agree with you that the church has kind of missed a trick here. That really ought to be a force for unity and not taking sides. And whilst, of course, church leaders will have their own views, of course, all the time I'm wondering, what would my father have done? My father was a bishop in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and I'm always wondering which side he would have gone. Of course, I can't know that. But what I do know is I was a teenager and always used to cringe when you say he feels the pain of being in the middle of, when you're working for reconciliation between 2 sides, you feel the pain. And actually, I feel that's where church leaders ought to be. They ought to be feeling the pain of a divided nation. Jesus wept of how divided we are and how contemptuous, mutually contemptuous people are. And, I really despair sometimes seeing on Twitter some church leaders taking such a clear line on one side, usually one particular side, and so divorced from and disconnected from their own people. I mean, the statistics show that actually the voting records of people in the churches are different from the church leadership.
Bring it to a close there, just to try and give us all a bit of respite. Sure. John?
Well, I'll try and be quick as well. On the question of metaphysics and climate change, I think that we've got a kind of division between people, people who just think that all that matters is kind of human beings, and somehow we'll find a way to put nature back together again. And on the other hand, people who say, well, human beings are awful and we need to not prioritize human beings any longer. And I think from a Christian point of view, we believe in the sanctity of the whole of nature, but we do also believe that human beings are special. And as human beings have done all the damage, it is only human beings who can put it back together again. And I think that balance of both, of respecting both nature and humanity, is something we have to offer. That question about language, I thought that was an absolutely brilliant question. And I would start with anthropology, so saying, well, what are human beings? How does do their minds somehow connect to their bodies? Isn't that a mystery? And why are we conscious? Why do we think we have free will? It's as if, the world we inhabit all the time of sort of love and willing and intentions is a world that science can't explain or even doesn't believe in. And I would start from the point that's saying, isn't common sense, everyday reality already kind of religious? It's religious language that makes most sense of our ordinary life. I think the next question is incredibly important as well. I do think we are in a kind of equivalent to that, almost that Civil War moment of fascinating questions. And what we're not facing up to is, Colonel Rainsbury is right, but our problem now is how do you represent people and make government legitimate? And in essence, we're having a tension between people who think that our system implies mandation. Robert Toombs said this in the Telegraph today. So is he a Jacobin, I want to ask at that point. And people who believe in a more Burkean representation, which I do. And I actually think that goes better with proportional representation. So the idea that you're not just mandated, you represent not just individuals, but different groups of interest, and you then make your own judgments. And I think part of the problem, and Maurice may not agree about this, in our relating to Europe, is precisely that they have more of that kind of system, and historically we have that system, but holding a referendum has blown that apart. Who actually, there aren't people to carry out this with the people. So there are, whatever you think about this, there are huge constitutional questions. I absolutely agree that the churches have totally failed to take the implicitly religious concerns of a lot of people who voted Brexit, their worries about identity, their worries about the exploitation to both sides involved in immigration, this kind of liberal pieties that the church, I am a Remainer, but I do wholly reject these kind of liberal pieties that the church has uttered in that respect. But the final point, to me, the most interesting thing you said about Cromwell was he was a military dictator, but in a way you could argue he kind of had to be. And there is a point, what do you do when democracy does break down? There is a moment where the imperative is not democracy, at least to ensure that people aren't going to die in the streets. This is why you get a Caesar figure, if you like. Maurice will really not like this, but I think that our lack of any sense of transcendence in our politics at all, I think in the past, by now, something like the force of the Crown would have intervened, and we would have simply withdrawn from Article 50, because that doesn't end Brexit, but it does mean it's so obvious that we can't, we're in a complete mess, that two sides are shouting each other and calling each other undemocratic and illegitimate. We actually really need to have a huge pause, and if we unilaterally withdraw, then we're not in hoc to the EU. There is no time period. We can take charge of that for ourselves.
Gentlemen, you don't need to answer everyone because I want to grab one more round, so maybe just pick the one that grabs you the most.
You first, Mike.
Okay, yeah, great. Pick up the 2 points, the point about young people and also the point that Molly made about kind of climate change. And I think both of those kind of speak to future generations. Just as adults, we have to take a long, hard look at ourselves and ask the question, what kind of legacy are we leading for our children and our children's children? And I think that, whether it's, our relationship to Europe or climate change and the way it impacts children. In my city at the moment, in Birmingham, we're having to grapple with the issue of actually, like you having a congestion zone because there are so many polluting cars that are literally destroying the health of our young people. We've got to take a long, hard look at ourselves and ask ourselves, how can we serve the future generations and at least leave them with something that they can pick up? And I think they feel we don't care. And you know what? I think they're probably right. We really need to listen to them.
Thank you.
Yep. So, first of all, Molly, I just want to say that there's certain times that we should be just deeply grateful, and hearing John talk about metaphysics and nature, I think that was a delight, and I just acknowledge that. Thank you for that. I've got to pick Jenny up on something. You say you're not a politician, you're not a theologian, but you may be wrong.
Definitely.
You know, you build relationships, you pursue the good, you build coalitions, and when you speak, it's completely infused with a theological understanding. So, sorry about that. And I think you answered Robert very well. So it's Daniel I'm going to address. By the way, the quote is written in stone right behind you, the one you spoke, just to say, isn't it amazing that that quote should come into your mind here? And those Putney debates, I agree with you, it elevates us. And in this debate, we have had a sort of brief sanctuary or hiatus from Brexit, but I don't think we could avoid it entirely, and I wouldn't wish to. So the thing in the Civil War and with the Putney debates was that there was something extraordinary that happened, is that previously illiterate peasants and working people, also artisans, read the Bible. Remember, there was this King James translation, it wasn't very long before it was 1603. By 1640, the English artisans had completely they'd read the Bible, and it inspired them in all the ways that Mike said, and that the lowest he should be. And what they said in the Putney debates was also this Norman yoke, which I think is a living tradition that essentially, you know, I campaigned in the referendum, but talking to people, you'd say, well, you know, in 1066, you know, 12 French people came and they stole our land, and it's been pretty uphill ever since. And what I want to tell you is that this really resonated. You know, you want to talk about housing. Well, who owns the land? Who owns the land? And you can still see that the inheritors of the Norman conquest own a considerable, and this is what the levellers and the diggers and the New Model Army in Putney were talking about, and they formed a different social base for politics, and they wanted an extension of democracy and participation. And Cromwell, in this place, because I'm a very sad person and I used to read about this, he said to them, a gentleman, a yeoman and a peasant, he said, that is the order of this country, and a great one. I beseech you in the bowels of Christ, think thee be wrong. And then he killed them. That's what he did. At night, in their tents here, they went into their tents, the faction of the New Model Army under Fairfax, and they killed them in their tents. I just want to honour them, but their legacy is forever, and we continue to be inspired by that. But then what that meant was that Cromwell had no social base other than what we would now call basically what became the Whigs, propertied people who wished to constrain the crown. And Cromwell is an extraordinary figure because he was ultimately conservative, as we could see from that, but also he said that, John, that King Charles I had overstepped the ancient constitution by exerting unique prerogative for the crown outside of accountability. So that was an incredible, you know, just as...
Yeah, but
what's important... I'm just raising...
There's a little seminar happening here between these two people.
I'm just raising the issue of the relationship between tyranny and transcendence, but that maybe is for a future moment.
Maybe.
But what's extraordinary is that this concept of the ancient constitution, where there's a balance of interest and not the separation of the powers, where locational power, that's through the constituencies, that's why PR removes accountability. It's very good that you have place represented, you have the representation of the church, and it doesn't take a huge imagination to talk about the representation of faith. So you had the locational power, you had the vocational power. Don't forget, universities were represented in terms of their corporate power of knowledge, and you also had the law represented. So this was a negotiated common good where there were understood to be differences. I found it quite moving yesterday that the Attorney General did not submit to the government in his interpretation, and I note that Goldsmith did in the Iraq War, and it didn't happen yesterday. So this just brings us back to where we were, and I'll just wind up here. I can know you're looking at me, but I'm not returning your gaze. I'm just acknowledging that with a slight...
I'm just listening intently, Maurice.
Is that what that was called at that time was the interregnum, right? What that period of the New Model Army, then where the democracy was killed, but still there needed to be a negotiation with the Crown about it was the king in Parliament and not outside of Parliament, that was fundamental to this constitution, and I think that's really, and in this interregnum, which was then picked up by Antonio Gramsci, an Italian Marxist, he said this fantastic thing: we're living in an interregnum right now, where everything is up for grabs. Sexuality is up for grabs, whether we're a nation state is up for grabs, whether the market works is up for grabs. The old settlement is dead, and he said that in an interregnum, he said, the old is dead, but the new cannot be born. There is a fraternization of opposites, and all manner of morbid symptoms pertain. And I haven't found a better definition of our present moment. And what I think is we have to get out of the interregnum. We can't get out of the interregnum without a vivid, imaginative leap towards a shared life, a common life. And there is no greater tradition of that than that was being carried by all the different aspects. What I said before about Lord, Tourney was High Church Anglican, Temple was High Church Anglican, and there was also this very vivid evangelical theological Puritan component, and they did build a common good. And when the king came back, he accepted the authority of Parliament, and the thing was resolved. So don't be impatient. This needs to be resolved, and that's it.
Well, that has taken our time for the rest of the questions, sadly, but I think it was worth it. I'm going to ask the rest of the panelists to just do maybe 30 seconds of closing remarks on what we've heard tonight, and then I give you full permission to mob these guys with your unasked questions over a glass of wine on the way out. In fact, do you want to go to Jenny?
Okay. Yeah, I think one of the things that's coming through tonight is what we're talking about, that what's needed is a theology of relationship. Yeah. And we've just tried to make a small contribution to that by designing a workshop that Christians can run themselves, that helps them to understand what the common good is in practice. And I think that's actually a missing piece at the moment that we need to look at. Just a word about vocational responsibility again. There's this sense of us needing to tell a rehumanizing story in which everyone is needed. We've got a situation now, we've got whole sections of society that aren't needed, that are easily discarded, that people are willing to live without. And there's actually a sort of rather worrying sort of sense that, depending on how things go, that people could just be ignored again. And that's very dangerous when you're living in a shared society where your fellow citizens are actually expendable. So I think we've really got to be very careful about that. And we're very struck as well about this sense of remembering the dead in here who are with us. I'm really a big fan of Community of Saints. When I converted to become a Catholic, it was a great discovery for me to feel that they're with us and we can draw on their wisdom, and they're a great resource for us. They're heroes, archetypes, mentors even. And I think that's something, again, that's sort of missing from mainstream life, is this sense of living with the inheritance that has gone before us, sort of wiping away of history as if none of it matters. And I think it's a huge resource for us. And I do think that the church, if we're able to get our act together and perhaps build some capacity where it's lacking, that we can help to contribute to pave the way towards a new settlement for the common good.
Beautiful.
Thank you. John?
Yes, I very much agree that the whole question of relationality is absolutely central. And I think from the church point of view, there's a need to sort of move away from the idea that the church is just a kind of movement of individual believers, and to recover the sense that the church is in itself a society, is, if you like, a polity that sort of goes beyond simply law towards reconciliation and towards a continuous process of mutual atonement. And I think that we've got to say quite boldly that it's the loss of actually, yes, that fully Catholic sense of what the church is, that it is a polity, that it is a process of mutual atonement, that in the end, by losing that, doesn't it look as if in the end the Western world is really losing its sense of the dignity of human life, that it's become expendable for the right, as Maurice says, human life itself can be commodified, it's dispensable for the left, who talks about acceleration and transhumanism, and has become wholly Nietzschean. We're going to turn into something else. And it looks as if without the Christian or equivalent other religious senses of the absolute dignity of the human person, that the human person reflects God, and that, you know, there's something going, you can only explain as vertically downwards. You can't, and maybe you can explain everything else as heading towards mind and feeling. And actually, philosophy is going that direction. Without this kind of vision, we're only going to have a more and more poisonous politics, and we're more and more going to destroy the natural world, I think.
Thank you. And final words from Mike.
Yeah, I'm reflecting at the moment on the last question that Jesus' disciples asked him before he ascended to heaven in the book of Acts. And he said to him, when will you restore the kingdom to Israel? And he batted away that question. And he says, go and wait, you will receive power. And it's not just Holy Spirit power, although to us Pentecostals, that is important. But I also think it was the subversive power of community. And when you read Acts chapter 2 and onwards from there, you see this on-the-ground movement that grows, and the authorities of the day just don't know what to do with it, because people are daily coming and wanting to be part of it. We've got to get back to that. That's the kind of underground movement that people are looking for, not institutions that are just shrill, but people on the ground who are living radically differently for one another. And if we do that, maybe, just maybe, we might see change in our communities.
One final word.
I just want to reflect for a moment, first of all, to say thank you for this, but also what I'm thinking, I'm continuing with this exchange with Daniel really, is what we can bring is covenantal thinking, that we're living with the dead, we extend our time horizons beyond the immediate, we have an absolute promise that we need to keep and redeem about liberty, about democracy, and about the dignity, and to reject contractual thinking. So what we are imprisoned by is this idea of an exchange between people that's immediate. But we know that love and grace and democracy and politics require intergenerational commitments. So I'm just giving a blast for covenantal thinking, and that really feels alive tonight here.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking our panelists.